Hi, everyone. Welcome to the July 9th edition of the TimeformUS Forecast. I'm David Aragona, and this week on the podcast, we're looking ahead to Saturday's card at Belmont Park featuring the Grade 1 Belmont Oaks and Belmont Derby, as well as the Grade 3 Victory Ride for the 3-year-old fillies. But those two turf stakes have attracted some really intriguing runners from the powerful Aidan O'Brien stable, and I think figuring out how to assess those horses seems like the key to unlocking this Pick 5 sequence, and we will be talking about the entire late Pick 5 sequence on this podcast as it begins with those three stakes and ends with a couple of turf races to end the card on Saturday. Now, my usual co-host on this podcast, Craig, is still out recovering, so we're going to continue with the theme of having some new guests on this podcast. And this week, I'm happy to be joined by handicapper Caleb Knight. Caleb's part of a group of handicappers on the YouTube channel On the Wrong Lead, and he's a young guy who's pretty sharp, so I'm looking forward to discussing some races with him. Caleb, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, David. Thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here. Cannot fill Craig's shoes or even come close, but happy to have the opportunity to talk some Belmont on closing weekend.
Now, before we get into the races and the handicapping, I just want to ask you a couple of questions. Now, I don't know if it's improper to ask your exact age, but I mean, you seem like a relatively young guy, and I know it's kind of a little bit rare to find young people in their 20s who are fans of the sport. So I'm just kind of curious to know how you've gotten involved and interested in racing.
Yeah, definitely. So I'm 29 for about 2 more months, and then I no longer will be in my 20s. But that being said, yeah, I got into racing mostly from my dad. He's been a big racing fan most of his life. So I grew up in West Virginia, about 15 minutes away from Mountaineer. So dad spent a lot of time up there, kind of, hanging around the track. He worked with horses when he was younger. So I wouldn't say like I grew up on a horse farm or anything close to that, but I definitely was familiar with the sport growing up through my family, and didn't really probably get into it more until my younger 20s, but have been following it pretty closely for about 8 or 10 years now. A couple of the guys on the Wrong Lead group, we started up mostly just because we enjoy it. We don't sell anything. We just enjoy making YouTube videos, previews, podcasts, and trying to put some educational content out there to try to get some more younger people involved in the sport, because it can be a little bit daunting at first.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there can be a pretty high learning curve to getting into racing, especially for somebody who's relatively young, because if you're getting into the betting side of it, or even, getting into the other side of being involved in the actual, administration of the sport, I mean, it can be a little daunting from a financial standpoint. And also, as I said, that learning curve. Yeah, your story seems kind of similar to mine. I mean, I also kind of got into racing through my dad, who I grew up in the northern New Jersey area, and he did a little bit of work at Monmouth Park, would go to Saratoga every summer, so that kind of thing. So I was just kind of around it all the time. And before we get into the handicapping, just talk a little bit more about On the Wrong Lead and how you got involved in that, and kind of what prompted you to take your interest in racing to that next level.
Sure. So I actually stumbled across, I was on Reddit one day just looking over the horse racing subreddit, found out they had a Discord channel for people to talk horse racing. So I joined that Discord a few years ago. And it's a good Discord, people just sharing ideas, it's talking about races and sharing some handicapping advice. So it's a really good place to kind of learn and share some thoughts. So I was active in there for a while, met a couple of other like-minded folks who were passionate about horse racing, and one thing led to another. And we kind of just came up with the idea of, let's just put out some YouTube videos on previewing certain races, cards, kind of see how it goes, if that's something people are interested in. And we ended up getting, we certainly don't have a big following, but we have a dedicated following, I will say. So we've ended up running for about 2 or 3 years now, I would say. So putting out weekly videos, we do streams on Thursday evenings where we'll typically preview a card for the upcoming weekend. Sometimes we do some live betting and handicapping for whatever tracks happen to be running on Thursday evening. So sometimes Turfway, Sam Houston, lately some Canterbury. And just recently, we actually partnered with Stable Duel. So it's a DFS app for horse racing. So we've lately been putting out some content for them and trying to get more people into the sport that maybe aren't horse players, but are DFS players, and trying to make the connection that way.
That's really awesome. I mean, trying to grow the sport and get more young people involved is the goal. I mean, that's kind of been the elusive goal for a lot of racetracks and racing administrators. So it's great to see people working on that level, that are kind of outside of the mainstream of the sport. So that's really cool. Let's get into the handicapping now because that's what people are obviously here for. And we're going to begin with those stakes races at Belmont Park. As I said, we talk about that entire late pick 5 sequence. It is races 7 through 11 at Belmont, and we're going to start things off with the first of those Grade 1 events. It is the Belmont Oaks Invitational, going 1.25 miles on the inner turf course. And I would assume that these stakes races are definitely going to stay on the turf. We'll see what happens with the last 2 races in this sequence. Hopefully everything stays on the turf. I know that a lot of rain has fallen already in the New York area, but given that it's the last week at Belmont Park, they don't really have to save the turf course for anything. So hopefully, even if it's soft or yielding, we get all these turf races in. But we're going to start things off by discussing some of the horses in this Belmont Oaks. And I think the conversation does have to start with these Aidan O'Brien runners. And, a lot's been made of the fact that Aidan O'Brien does not have the strongest statistics with these U.S. shippers. But I think that the 2 that he's brought over for these races are not cut from the same cloth as some of the horses that he's brought in the past. They seem to be of a higher quality. So how are you looking at kind of getting around or assessing these Aidan O'Brien horses?
Yeah, I think that you really nailed it with the intro, and that the key to unlocking this late sequence really does start and end with the Aidan O'Brien runners. I also agree with you completely that in the past, Aidan O'Brien has sent some horses over that maybe were his junior varsity squad. And oftentimes, Aidan O'Brien is a supporter of US racing, so he does send over quite a few horses to have a presence over here. And sometimes they maybe aren't his best. That being said, these 2 that he has in the Oaks and the Derby, these are not we had space on the bus kind of horses. These horses seem very well meant to me and are very highly regarded overseas. I really do think that Santa Barbara is the horse to beat in this race here in the Belmont Oaks. And partially it's from her own body of work, and partially I'm just not totally enamored with any of the US runners in here. So that last out race by Santa Barbara in the Pretty Polly Stakes was an outstanding effort. She was facing older horses at the Curragh, going 1.25 miles, which she gets the same distance today. And she just missed to a horse, Thundering Nights. So if you remember back, Thundering Nights actually ran at Belmont maybe a month or 2 ago in the Grade 2 New York Stakes. And she just lost to Mean Mary in a really tight photo finish. That was on a day where Mean Mary had control of the pace on a pretty slow pace, as she tends to get. And Thundering Nights had to come from well off of that slow pace. So that was a huge effort. I think that flatters Santa Barbara here by only losing to Thundering Nights by a neck. Ryan Moore ships over. I know that Aidan O'Brien does not have the strongest numbers with sending horses to the States. Last year, I decided I wouldn't use them, and he filled out the entire trifecta in the Breeders' Cup Mile. So I think, with those statistics, you do need to be a little bit careful of, but wouldn't talk anybody against this horse if you want to take a stand against. But I do think that she certainly is the horse to beat. It is a little hard to really get your head around what happened in the Epsom Oaks back when she got beat by 21 lengths, but that really may have just been more of an instance of snowfall absolutely freaking that day. I think she really relished the softer going, and Santa Barbara maybe didn't handle the pretty stiff ground all that well, and that may have been just stepping up a little too much in trip, going from 1 mile to 1.5 miles. I think 1.25 miles is where she wants to be, and I very much do think she's probably the horse to beat here, especially if the track comes up with some moisture in it.
Yeah, we've got a really similar take on this favorite, and I'll be interested to see how low they make her on the tote board. I kind of probably was a little bold going as low as even money on the line because they typically don't bet these Aidan O'Brien runners as heavily as you might assume based on their Grade 1 placings overseas when they come over here. But it does feel like these deserve a little more respect than some ones that he's brought in the past, as we were kind of getting at. And I agree with everything you said about her European form. Her last race was awesome. I also am willing to give her that excuse for the Epsom Oaks. It just felt like Snowfall was one that loved that soft going, and the 13 other horses just didn't care for it that much. And that's kind of why the margin of victory was so massive impressive in the Epsom Oaks. But going all the way back to this filly's debut last year at the Curragh, I mean, just watching that race and the way she dispatched of those, what was it, 17 rivals that she was facing. I mean, she won that race with so much ease, and she looked like a future Group 1 winner in that performance. And she hasn't quite gotten there yet, but it seems like Aidan O'Brien's got her on the right trajectory now. And it does feel like he's running her here with real intention. So I personally couldn't get around her. I think that she's the horse to beat and the most likely winner. Just depends on how low of a price you want to take, but she is the kind of horse that I would lean on in the first leg of this pick 5 sequence. As for the Americans, I kind of agree. I'm not thrilled with the overall group of them. I guess the strongest contenders are the ones coming out of the Wonder Again. The Wonder Again felt like a stronger race going into it than it did coming out, at least from my perspective. And Colin Lima ran fine, but she got a great trip in that race. And even though you don't really know what the fractions were because there were some timer malfunctions for that race, it did feel like a really slow pace. So I guess the right horse to take out of there is Plum Ali, but I kind of have the same concerns about her here as I did in the Wonder Again, because there's not a lot of pace once again, and she's going to have to make that late rush from probably pretty far back. So I just wonder if she can improve on the results from last time, but she kind of does feel like the right alternative if you're going to go against the favorite.
I agree. I do think that the Wonder Again is a race that I'm treating with a little bit of skepticism. As you mentioned, they had a little bit of timer issues there. The rails were all the way out to 35 feet on the inner, which is not a configuration that's run a ton here at Belmont. And I do think that the wide trip from the very back of the pack did probably compromise Plum Ali quite a bit. I think she was probably best in that race, whereas Con Lima got a beautiful ride by Flavian Pratt, saved all the ground and just shot up the hole once it opened. So I do agree with you. Plum Ali is probably the horse here if you do want to take an American. I also have a passing interest in Gam's Mission, the 8 horse. I'm not really sure if she's this good, but she really hasn't done anything wrong. I mean, she lost to Aunt Pearl in her maiden debut and then rattled off 3 consecutive wins while stretching out a little bit more in each start and posting speed figures that are continually improving. These are the kind of horses that I like to get on early. She's continually moving forward. She seems to be really in sharp form right now. The local jock, Adam Beskiza, comes up to keep the mount. So I think there's a lot to like here. I do think she can be a little more tactical than a horse like Plum Ali. And I don't know if you really can beat Santa Barbara. I'm not going to try very hard to. But if I was going to look at others, I think she's one that interests me.
Yeah, she's an interesting horse coming out of the Regret. I'm not sure how strong I think that race was, even kind of in relation to the Wonder Again, but she does seem like she's got that forward trajectory. And I mean, I actually liked her a bit last time, and she went off at 6-1 in that race, which I was a little surprised about because she seemed like a little more logical than that. But she does seem like one that's got a really strong, relentless finish to her. So that gives me some hope that she can handle the 1.25 mile distance, which is a question that a lot of these have to answer. A lot of these American trained fillies have to answer. So I have no problem with her. I mean, the one other horse that I guess I would give a look to before we move on from this race is the other Euro shipper, Sirona, who's coming in from France. Obviously, that pre-Saint Ellery 2 back where she lost by a head at the Group 1 level wasn't really the same kind of Group 1 race as the Pretty Polly that Santa Barbara exits. That one was restricted to 3-year-olds and just not really the same quality of horses. But she also didn't get the right trip last time in the Prix de Diane. So she does feel like a horse that could be dangerous if they decide to use her early speed, because she has done her best running on the front end in Europe and she handles some given the ground. So those are all positives. I'm just not quite sure that I think she's good enough.
Yeah, I have a similar take on Serrano as well. I'm not going to hold the last against her too much. I mean, Joan of Arc's a talented filly in her own right, but she does feel like she'd probably need to improve a little bit to win here, or have a few of the others maybe not show up with their best effort. But you are getting a price there at 12-1 in the morning line. I do think that you get paid to take that risk, and by no means am I against her at all here.
Let's move on to the second leg of this pick 5 sequence. It's the 8th race, the Grade 3 Victory Ride, going 6.5 furlongs on the dirt for the 3-year-old fillies. And I think this is one that could change a little bit with some scratches that may or may not come in. I guess we have to see how this field ultimately shakes out. But I did see that the number 4, Overcharged, is, I think, cross-entered in a turf race as an MTO, I believe, on Saturday. Bella Sophia on the rail. She is entered on Sunday at Belmont in a non-winners of one other than allowance race, where she would likely to be a heavy favorite. So I think it remains to be seen if some horses will come out of here. But as the race stands right now, it does seem like there's quite a bit of speed signed on, and that just kind of figures to play into the hands of the likely favorite Australasia, who's coming out of a really nice victory last time in the local prep for this, the Jersey girl. And I don't know, this one's just done nothing wrong in her career, and it seems like she's going to get a great setup once again.
Yeah, I was looking at the sequence on the whole, and it felt a little bit on the chalky side. We do have some formidable favorites, and Australasia is another one who 6 for 6, undefeated. She backed it up. I was a little concerned when she was beating up on some Louisiana breds down at Delta that she might not be able to translate that to Churchill and Belmont, but she really has just continued to get better. Brad Cox has this filly in just incredible form right now. She has wins across 4 different tracks, distances ranging from 5.5 furlongs all the way up to a 2-turn mile. So she really hasn't done anything wrong. And even in her last race, I went back and watched that replay, and she looked like she wasn't going to get there, and then all of a sudden just had this incredible turn of foot in the last 16th of a mile or so to get up by a pretty comfortable length. So I do think that she, if the scratches don't necessarily come through, I do think she gets an outstanding pace setup here. And she is a favorite that I'm not going to try too hard to beat, but there is probably one other horse that I have an interest in here, but I'm curious to see where you landed first.
Yeah, we kind of have a similar take on these first couple of races. I try to get past these favorites when I first start looking at these races, but I don't know. Australasia just looks like she's got really solid form coming into this. And like you, I was really impressed with that last race and the turn of foot that she displayed through the stretch. I mean, when you watch the race and kind of disregard the fractions, you assume that they were going pretty quickly up front for her to be able to make up as much ground as she did in the final quarter mile. But when you kind of take the pace of that race apart, they actually didn't go that fast up front. And Bella Sophia was able to get to the lead primarily because her main rival, Miss Brazil, didn't break and some others didn't get rides that were that aggressive. So, I mean, 45-3 is not that fast a pace going 6 furlongs when the final time is 109 flat. And I mean, I was looking at the Trackist numbers for the come home time for Australasia, and Trackist got her coming home her final quarter in 22.9 seconds, which is just blazing on the dirt. I mean, she was just flying at the end of that race. And now she gets an extra half furlong to work with. If the race does hold together and those two key speeds don't come out of this race, she's likely to get a good pace setup. And even if those speeds do come out, she's got a really adaptable running style where she doesn't have to come from that far back. So she just seems like a really solid contender here. And I mean, I wouldn't want to take that short a price on her. If she drifts too low off that 2-to-1 line, then maybe that's a negative a little bit, because this is a competitive race with plenty of talented runners. But she just looks like a really solid contender and the most likely winner of this race. So I put her on top, and I would lean on her a little bit in this pick five sequence. There aren't that many other horses that I want to use it here. I mean, coming out of that Jersey girl, I think you do have to respect Miss Brazil because she broke through the gate prior to the start, didn't run off at all. I mean, she was quickly apprehended and loaded within about a minute's time. But I mean, it kind of did mess with her mental game a little bit because she broke slowly when the race actually started and just seemed like she was never really as aggressive as she usually is. So I think that she could bounce back here. And I think if some other speeds do scratch out, that helps Miss Brazil probably more than anybody else because she does her best running on the front end. And it's not clear if she's really fast enough to get ahead of horses like Bella Sophia and Overcharged. So I'll be interested to see how the scratches come in relative to her chances. But I mean, as far as the bigger prices in this race go, I've got trouble really latching on to any of them, except for maybe one that I'd use underneath. But I'm interested to know where you would go for a bigger price in this race.
Yeah, I agree with you about Miss Brazil. I think she is one you can excuse, but I don't know that you're going to get much of a price on her either in this spot. She would certainly stand to benefit if the other speed scratched out. But assuming the other speed maintains in, the one horse at a price that I thought looked kind of usable was the 5, Super Sensational. So there is a chance that this filly is just better on the synthetic, where she has her 2 wins. But I also think that she's just better going around one turn. She had her first two wins up at Woodbine going 7 furlongs, and she pretty much dominated two fields up there, including a listed stakes race for 2-year-olds. She then shipped down to Fairgrounds for the winter when Woodbine wasn't running and put in a respectable enough second place in her first start, coming off the bit of the layoff. They got a little ambitious with her and put her in a couple of grade twos in the Rachel Alexandra and the Fairground Oaks, and ran into two of the better fillies on that circuit with Travel Column and Clairiere twice in a row. I just don't think she really wants a mile and a 16th. She just seems to lose a little bit of that late kick that she had going 7 furlongs. So they finally cut her back to 7 furlongs on the Oaks undercard in the 8 bells. And I don't think she got the right trip that day. There was a pretty quick pace in that race. The winner, Obligatory, ended up coming from dead last to loop the field and win going away. So she wasn't that far off that quick pace, and she was saving ground along the inside. And I think she just got compromised a little bit when some of the tiring leaders started backing up and she really didn't have anywhere to go. I'm not sure she was ever winning that race, but when she finally did get in the clear, she ended up kicking in and passing two horses and making a nice run. I also feel like this is a much softer spot than that 8 bells, despite the fact that this is a grade three. I think that Obligatory or Day Out of the Office would both be pretty heavy favorites in a race like this. So I think Super Sensational is one at a price that probably gets that first run trip, sitting behind the speeds. And if she can work out a trip and avoid some traffic, I do think she might get first run on Australasia and might have enough in the tank to hold her off.
Yeah, we were kind of looking at the same price horse in this race. I couldn't quite get to the point where I was considering her a top pick or anything like that because I'm not sure how good she really is. But I agree about her last trip. She did have that minor trouble at the top of the stretch, and I do think, despite that pedigree, that shorter might be better for her. I mean, I worry a little bit with these Cassie runners that sort of don't develop the way that you expect them to. It seems like they almost never really get there when they look promising and don't pan out. And she's kind of getting a little bit of that profile where she looked like she had a really promising start to her career and then she just didn't deliver in some races that she was supposed to. But maybe that the one turn is just kind of the right spot for her. So we'll see if she gets the pace that she needs. But she seems like one that you could use as a backup or potentially get into there underneath in exotic wagers. Let's move on to the ninth race, the middle leg of this pick five sequence. It is the other grade one, the Belmont Derby. This one for the 3-year-old male horse who's going 1.25 miles on the inner turf, same distance as the Belmont Oaks. And once again, we're faced with a likely favorite from the Aidan O'Brien stable. That is the number 2 Bolshoi Ballet. And this horse looked really talented through the early part of the season in Europe, was sent off as the heavy favorite in the Epsom Derby, and just didn't deliver in that race. Never looked like he was traveling that well, didn't run well, but the connections seemed to think he had a big excuse for that performance. So they're running him here with some high hopes. And if he runs to his top effort, which we saw too back at Leopardstown, he's going to be pretty tough for these American 3-year-olds to handle.
Yeah, Bolshoi Ballet is a tough horse for me to really figure here. He has a big excuse in that last where he apparently suffered a laceration on his hindquarters at the start of the race, and he came out of that race quite sore. But connections clearly think he's in good shape as they, ship him over here for the Belmont Derby. So I just don't know what to really make out of him. His Leopardstown race two back probably wins today, probably wins comfortably today. Leopardstown, I mean, this horse is 3 for 3 at Leopardstown and 0 for 3 anywhere else. I will say that Leopardstown tends to play a little similar, more similar anyway, to American tracks. It's a more gentle turns. It's a left-handed oval. It doesn't have all the undulations a track like Epsom or Ascot does. So I do think his style will translate pretty well to the Belmont turf course. But my question is just how short of a price do I really want to take on this horse? I'm not particularly convinced that he beat a ton in that Darristown Stud Derby trial back in May 9th. I know that Max Sweeney was in that race, who is a multiple Group 1 winner, who exited that race to win the Irish 2000 Guineas. But I really think Max Sweeney is just better going a mile. They've tried him at 1.25 miles and 1.5 miles a couple times, and I just don't think he really wants to go that far. So I do think that Bolshoi Ballet may have just exploited Max Sweeney at the wrong distance, and I don't think there was a whole lot else in that race. So to me, this is of the Aidan O'Brien runners. I'm going to play more strongly through his filly in the Oaks. This is one that I might try to get around because I do think there are some American horses in here that do have some real talent. A horse like Hard Love, for example, it's going to be hard to avoid the Catholic Boy comparisons, but I think that he is one that could be quite a nice horse. They scratched him out of the Pinion Ridge when it came off the turf and instead put him in a non-winners of two allowance race against older horses. And he got the job done, beating a fairly salty group of older allowance horses. Value Engineering, uh, as well as a Godolphin Shipper, Desert Peace were in there. So I don't think it was the strongest allowance in the world, and it is tough to go from an allowance to a grade one. But 3-year-old turf horses don't have a ton of grade one, grade two opportunities prior to this race. So I'm a little bit more forgiving of that. And I think that he does give the Americans a good chance in here.
Yeah, I mean, we kind of have a similar take on Bolshoi Ballet. He feels like one that I want to take a shot against because I do like some of the Americans in this race and think they're pretty talented. And I mean, Bolshoi Ballet, he kind of comes in as a horse with that one huge effort to a back, and that makes him a clear standout in this race. But his other performances, his other 5 performances, they make him a contender, but they don't make him a heavy favorite. So I just kind of wonder what we're going to get from him. And you make some really good points about Leopardstown and him only having been successful out of his own backyard, basically in Ireland so far. And maybe that's something noteworthy for a horse who's shipping all the way across the Atlantic Ocean now. But it does seem like he could be a horse that's well suited to American racing, I guess, depending on how much rain we've gotten over the past couple days in New York, because maybe he doesn't want a very soft turf course, though I think as much rain as we've gotten, it's not going to be as soft as some of the courses that we do see in Europe. But he is formidable, and he's a horse that I think you have to use in some capacity. But like you, I want to look at some of these American horses and give them some respect in this race. And we agree about Hard Love. I mean, he just makes a ton of sense. I don't foresee him as being a horse that's going to have any problem handling the 1.25 mile distance. And I was impressed with his last race, the fact that he was able to still win against that tougher competition. I mean, he got a great trip, like right up on a pace that was not that fast. And the pace really did hold together, and some horses that were trying to come from behind maybe had a little bit of traffic trouble to deal with. But he still delivered in that race and ran a career best speed figure, the kind of number that we really haven't been seeing from too many of these 3-year-olds at this time of year. So he's moving in the right direction now. Jonathan Thomas, it seems like that barn has been firing pretty consistently for the past few months, and that is a stable that can be a little bit streaky. So those are all good signs for Hard Love. I just want to see what kind of price he's going to be, how close he's going to be on the wagering to Bolshoi Ballet, because I could see there being a gap, but I could also see them being relatively similar because I know the American bettors do tend to favor the more familiar horses. So we'll see what price he goes off at. I definitely prefer him to the other American runner with credentials, Du Jour, who I think has some more stamina questions to answer. And you've got the issue with him coming out of the Bob Baffert barn and with a turf horse. I don't really know what to make of that. How do you assess him and kind of the other Americans in this race?
So I'm with you. I'm going to take a stand against Du Jour here. I don't know how much the public's going to bet this horse, but I feel like he will take some money here. Just leaving the Baffert barn to me is a big question mark. I don't know how he's going to respond, now being in the Belmont barn. He also had an absolutely perfect trip in that American turf back at Churchill. He sat a few lengths off of a very hot pace. He saved all the ground along the fence and then just had a hole open up for him where he tips out too wide and wins going away. I'm also not sure about how great of a grade two that was. I know he's the only grade two winner in this field, but of the 9 runners to come out and race again, they're a combined 1 for 12 in their next starts. I'm not really sure that was an overly strong race, and I'm also not really sure that 1.25 miles is exactly what this colt wants to do. So I'm taking a stand against him. There are a few others in here that I have some interest in, though. The number 4 Sainthood I thought was really interesting, and I think he certainly is the wild card of this race as far as the Americans are concerned. I've always thought he did strike me a little bit more as a turf horse than a dirt horse. Arguably, his 2 best races came over the synthetic and over the sloppy track last out. And generally, horses that run well on synthetic and even the slop tend to translate that form pretty well onto the turf. So I'm expecting him to handle the surface. Todd Pletcher said he's been working well over the turf lately. and he was entered in the Pinion Ridge, which was clearly intended for the turf. I'm not going to take a whole lot from the Pinion Ridge in a race that's washed off the turf. I know the speed figure came back a little bit light, but the only thing I'm really going to gather from that is that he has the ability to be pretty tactical. So I do like Sainthood here. I wouldn't say that I'm necessarily going to put him on top, but if you do get around that 10-1 morning line, I thought he's a horse that, that Jeff Ruby Stakes figure he ran on Timeform is in the conversation of what it would take to win. And if you can project any improvement, or if he can replicate that from his March race, I do think he could make some sense here.
Yeah, I mean, he's definitely an interesting horse. Like you said, he's a wild card in this race. You don't really know what you're going to get from him, but it does feel like he's supposed to be a square price, and he's got a little bit of turf pedigree. I'm still not exactly sure what I think of the Mshawishis or Mishawish, or however you say that sire's name on the turf. I mean, we've seen some handle it. The overall stats are not stellar. I mean, that sire did handle the turf himself during his racing career. So, I mean, I get it. I feel like he's a horse that might be successful on the surface. And if he merely does translate that synthetic form to turf, he's a contender in this race. I wanted to go in a different direction and kind of highlight a horse that I think is going to offer some value. And I'm probably getting a little too creative here, but this is a horse that I have a thing for. And that's the number 3, Safe Conduct, who I think is coming into this race a little bit underrated based on his turf performances. They kept him in that Pennine Ridge last time when it came off the turf just to get a race into him, kind of not wanting to take the hard love route of racing against older horses. I guess not even sure if he'd make it into that race, or he probably couldn't because he was I shouldn't say that. They're both 2-time winners. But anyway, Safe Conduct in his 3 turf races, he's been big prices both times that he's won. And typically horses that win at big prices, you say, okay, well, you should have had them that day. But he's going to be a big price once again. And I think that those performances are still not quite as respected as they should be. That allowance race that he won 2 back at Belmont, going a mile and a 16th on May 2nd, the speed figure came back okay, a little bit higher on the buyer than the TimeformUS number. But as we've seen horses run back out of that race and kind of watching that race in retrospect, it feels like a really strong allowance race for the level. Public Sector, who was second, obviously came back and was a good runner-up in the Manila Stakes last weekend, arguably was the best horse in that race, being against the pace. And there were some good ones in behind that have since come back to run well. And Safe Conduct was just a dominant winner of that race. He got a good trip, stalking a moderate to slow pace. But when they got into the stretch, he really kicked for home impressively. I like to look up those Trackus come home times, and Trackus caught him coming home his final quarter in 21.97 seconds, which is just extremely fast. I mean, that was a hard turf course, but that's really flying at the end of a race, and didn't even look like he was doing it with a great deal of like having to be pressed that hard. I mean, he was running pretty easily through the wire. So there are questions about him handling the 1.25 mile distance, but I think Jose Lezcano is going to be aggressive in this race. He's going to have him forwardly placed, and I just got some minor questions about everybody in here, and this one's going to be a big price, and I think he's got talent. So I made him my top pick, but he's the kind of horse that I would use in a pick 5 sequence and try to also have some coverage to other ones.
I think that makes a lot of sense. I wasn't sure what to do with Safe Conduct. I think he's sort of had the advantage of being close on a couple slow paces, but he did, like you said, pull away pretty impressively in that allowance race on May 2nd, which did come back quite strong, despite the fig maybe being a little on the slower side. So I think that in this race, what I struggled to fully understand is what the pace setup might look like. I guess that I assumed maybe the 8-horse Cellist would get to the lead, but the 3 Safe Conduct is certainly a horse that wants to be forwardly placed. It sort of feels like there's about 5 horses that want to sit second in this race, which makes it a little tricky as far as projecting the pace and whether it's going to be swift or if it's going to be one horse out there by himself. But I do think that Safe Conduct should set an excellent trip here and could very well get lost on the board. So I wouldn't be against him at all at 15-1.
Yeah, the TimeformUS pace projector has this characterized as a fast pace, which I get why it worked out that way, but I don't necessarily see it playing out that way on the racetrack. I mean, like you said, you've got about 5 horses who kind of have that speed, stalker running style, and the pace projector takes that all into account. So that's why it's predicting that fast pace. It's just that when you get the actual riders in the starting gate, it feels like they're not all going to be aggressive. So you're likely to have one make it out to the front or a couple be, enterprising coming out of the starting gate. So I would imagine it's going to be a moderate pace. I don't think they're going to be crawling up front, but it does seem like in these 2-turn races on the inner turf, it always is a benefit to be somewhat forwardly placed. Let's close things out in this pick 5 sequence by talking about the last 2 races after these stakes are run, beginning with the penultimate leg of the sequence, the 10th race. It's a maiden special weight going 7 furlongs on the Widener turf course. And we're going to talk about this like it stays on the turf, and hopefully it does. There are a few MTOs in here, but I think it would become a little bit less interesting if it was moved onto the main track. So for the turf, I think we've got probably 3 major contenders in here, with the clear horse to beat being Ranger Fox, who just lost by a nose at this level last time on the Belmont Stakes undercard, ran well at this distance that day. And if he repeats that performance, he's going to be tough for this field to handle.
Yeah, Ranger Fox is certainly the horse to beat. He was a tough luck loser in each of his last 2 and getting nailed in the shadow of the wire twice. He has excellent early speed in a race that has a lot of unknowns with some first time starters and lightly raced horses, but have to think that he's going to be out there on the fronts, potentially unchallenged. So I do think he is very much the horse to beat. And I'm not really going to be against him, but he wasn't my top pick here. My top selection was actually a horse that lost to Ranger Fox last out, which was the 8 Migrate. I think that this is a horse that just looked like he really needed a start in that debut. Belmont is not really known for getting first time starters to win, especially on the turf. And this horse just looks like he raced very greenly in that debut. He was off a few lengths slow, taken up at the back of the pack. He then made a move wide. He tried to tip out wide into the stretch, couldn't really find the running room that he needed. He ended up diving into the rail, passed a couple of horses, and he was never winning that race. But I think that was an excellent race to get him some experience under his belt. And I do think that he's going to be a lot more professional in the second start. And that is the horse that I like to take a big step forward here and maybe able to turn the tables on Ranger Fox. But the way that I looked at it, those 2 are very much the 2 horses to beat in this field.
Yeah, I agree about Ranger Fox. As I was kind of trying to figure out how the pace of this race is going to shake out, it does feel like he's probably going to be on a clear lead. And he got some pressure in that maiden race last time on June 5th. And I think that ultimately made him susceptible to that late run from Soft Power, who might actually be a pretty talented Chad Brown horse. So I don't really fault Ranger Fox for losing that race. And this time, I mean, I guess unless the number 4 Beckenbauer under Gary Richards, that low percentage rider who kind of tries to send everything to the front, unless he's super aggressive, it feels like Ranger Fox is going to be on a clear lead under Joel Rosario. So I would imagine he'll be tough to run down in this race. I mean, the horse that you highlighted, Migrate, it definitely is interesting in here. And you would think he's likely to take a step forward based on that debut performance when, like you said, he was off slowly, he was green. He was so green in that race, I wonder if he still has some things to figure out even in his second career start. I mean, obviously you would hope that he learned some things from that experience, but I never personally like taking Junior Alvarado with horses that are kind of difficult to handle. I feel like sometimes he lets the horse do what it wants to do rather than trying to kind of muscling his way into getting them to listen to him. So I wonder a little bit about that. That kind of gave me some cause for pause. And also Bill Mott, when I look up his statistics in Formulator, he actually, while he doesn't have great stats with first-time starters, with maiden second-time starters and turf sprints, I think he's 0 for 16 over the past 5 years. And maybe that's just the fact that the horses in that sample were not really that short, very short prices. And maybe it was just the wrong set of horses. It could be an aberrational statistic, but I found that a little bit interesting. So, I mean, he's definitely one I'll use in a pick 5 type of sequence, but I did give preference to Ranger Fox. And I guess the one other horse you could consider is Deregulation on the outside for Chad Brown. He made a bit of a middle move in his debut. That's, I think, another race where the rail setting was way out in the course, and I would take those fractions with a grain of salt, but it was a slow pace and he made a move into the slowest part of the race. And then kind of once they sprinted late, Ranger Fox, who was also second in that race, he sprinted away from him. So I guess that horse could be forwardly placed this time and maybe he'll improve second time out, but it feels like these Chad Brown second time starters often take a little more money than they really deserve to.
Yeah, I'm going to be against deregulation here. I watched the race that a couple of these, well, the three top picks basically exit the same race. And I just wasn't very impressed with him visually. He did make that middle move and looked a winner almost going into the turn. And then he really flattened out pretty bad. He ended up just kind of running in place and was actually going backwards toward the end of the race and didn't hold on to fourth by much. And that's just so unusual to really see these Chad Brown horses that you're so used to seeing these explosive kicks and big turn of foot. And this horse just didn't really seem to have that big late kick and was just tired. I mean, that was just so unusual for me. He could take a step forward in his second start. I mean, Chad Brown is, obviously an outstanding trainer, but I think at, what is he, 5-2? He's one that I'd like to play against, especially coming out of the very wide post, and just wasn't really impressed with his first start.
Was there anybody else in here that caught your fancy or you found interesting at prices, or you just think it's about these contenders? Because I kind of couldn't make a case for the bigger prices in this race.
I could not either. I tried to look at some of the first time starters, but most of these barns just really don't get horses to fire first out, or they don't have what I would see as very much turf pedigree. I couldn't find a way to make a case for anyone else on the turf anyway.
Let's move into the last leg of this sequence, the 11th race, which closes out this card. And if the sequence seemed pretty logical or straightforward so far, things definitely get more difficult in this finale, as it's a wide open $25,000 claimer going a mile and a 16th on the inner turf. And I mean, it's hard to even know where to start in this race. So many of these horses have both positives and negatives about them. I mean, I guess the number 3 Solio, if he shows up with his best effort, he's probably just a little classier than this field, but you do kind of wonder what you're going to get from this 7-year-old who's seeing some better days and he's making his first start off the claim for a barn that is pretty dangerous, but he's not a horse that possesses a ton of early speed, and you just never want to trust these horses at short prices. I personally wanted to look for an alternative.
I agree with you. This race, I probably spent more time on this race than the prior 4 put together. This race was certainly a challenge. And I looked at Solio, and I think at 5-2, he's a horse that I'm going to try to beat. Like you mentioned, he does have a lot of back class, and if 2019 Solio shows up, then I think he's going to be tough to beat. But I also think that's kind of a big if. He only raced twice in all of 2020, and then in 2021, he just has not really looked like the same horse. His speed figures have been kind of going backwards lately. And I also think he's better going a little bit longer. I think he does his best work in that mile and 3/8 kind of a range, maybe out to a mile and a half. I think a mile and a 16th. He does own a win over that distance, but I do think that's a little on the sharp side for really what he wants to do. So I'm going to go against him while also recognizing that coming out of the Noda barn, he very much could move this horse up and be a runaway winner, but he's just not one that I could really trust. And at a short price, I thought there was too many other horses in here that looked pretty interesting to me.
Yeah, I kind of felt the same way. I mean, he's one that I guess you do have to use. I don't want to say defensively because I know that triggers some people in this ticket construction conversation. But I mean, he is a horse that I think is a contender in this race. And there was a time when you could kind of fade these Orlando Noto horses off the claim because he just while he was getting horses to improve after spending some time in his barn, he wasn't necessarily clicking at a high rate first off the claim. It seems like that's really changed over the past 6 months or so, and especially at this Belmont meet, he's had a lot of success first off the claim, even on the turf a couple times. So I do respect this horse. I feel like there are others that are similarly interesting at bigger prices. And I mean, it's hard to know kind of where to go after this. I mean, I guess another horse that is going to take some money off a trainer switch is a counter offer who moves into the dangerous Rob Atras barn. He's one that doesn't have quite as much back class as Solio, but he does have back races that make him somewhat interesting. You've got some horses on the outside like Boru and Noble Thought who have faced some better horses recently. Where were you looking to go to try to beat the favorite?
Sure. So I ended up bouncing back and forth between two horses for my top selection. I ended up on the one you mentioned first, Counter Offer. 3 for 24 lifetime horses generally aren't my jam, but this is a horse that I do think the barn change is going to make a lot of difference. I also dug back pretty far into his past performances to find those 3 wins because it has been a while. And all 3 of those wins came on turf with some give in the ground. So I do think that the weather conditions with the rain pretty much pouring down nonstop the last 2 days, I think getting back to a turf that's going to have a little more cut in it is going to benefit him. Also, all 3 of those wins came at tracks like Churchill and Saratoga, which I tend to think those turf courses play a little more similarly to Belmont as opposed to the Gulfstream turf course where he's been running. That's just a much harder, firmer turf course in general that doesn't quite translate the same way up to New York. I mean, I've heard Chad Brown say his horses don't particularly care for the Gulfstream turf and they don't run quite as well down there. So he doesn't ship down there all that often. So I think getting back to a more a turf course that's more in line with where he's been successful is going to make a difference. Plus the barn switch, I think, is going to help him out a lot as well. There was a lot of ways I wanted to go in here, but there's just so many questions about other horses that I don't think there's a bad pick in this entire race. But Counter Offer is probably the one I thought I was going to take a shot with.
You've actually kind of convinced me a little bit to upgrade Counter Offer because you make some really good points, especially about the Gulfstream turf course, kind of compared to the turf courses that he's been successful on in the past, like those courses at Churchill and Saratoga. And you're right, they had a lot of given them. I know that one Churchill turf course that he won on his listed firm, but that was one of those situations where a lot of rain fell and was actually closer to a yielding course. Similar thing at Saratoga where he won in a bog. So that's actually a really interesting point about Counter Offer, and I think it makes him a horse that you can consider in this race and have some hope that maybe he can get back to his better effort. So I agree. He's, especially now that I've heard you kind of give him the push, he's one that I'll upgrade a little bit. I kind of leaned a little bit more towards those horses towards the outside. Again, not with a lot of conviction because this is a race that it's hard to be too sure of anything in. But I did feel like Noble Thought and Boru, especially the former horse, are coming out of slightly tougher races. Obviously, Noble Thought competed for the $40,000 and $50,000 claiming tags in his last 2 starts. And those horses that beat him, like Karam and Attentive and Seismic Wave, they're just better horses than the ones he's facing in this race. And I mean, I get it. He wasn't really competitive in any of those races. He was just kind of outrun the entire way. But I thought he was at least in the mix too back until the late stages when his rider kind of gave up in the last furlong, kind of clear that he wasn't going to be part of the Superfecta. And then last time, that $40,000 claimer on June 19th, that was a race where they let Heeman Harkey get loose on a long shot and open up about 6 lengths on the backstretch, setting very pedestrian fractions. And it was almost like the whole field forgot that he was in the race. And they all kind of just were too late motivating their horses to go after that one. And Noble Thought didn't really pick up in the stretch the way that some others did, but he was also so far back at the quarter pole that he never had any chance to make an impact in that race. And now he's making his first start off a trainer switch to Rudy Rodriguez's brother, Gustavo. And he's started a couple horses so far, and they've both run pretty well. I think maybe slightly above expectations. So I don't think it's a negative trainer switch by any means. And it just feels like he's going to be a decent price in this race. And he's another one that has plenty of back class. And I'm just hoping he can kind of remember a little bit of who he once was.
Yeah, the 2 that you mentioned are, well, 2 of the 3 that I was looking between. I think you make some good points on Noble Thought. When I was trying to evaluate him, I couldn't really decide if those last 2 races were just a little on the poor side because of the hike in class or if it was more related to the barn change. So I kept going back and forth. I think I can probably give him an excuse just given that, like you said, those are better horses. Attentive is a horse that appears in a number of these past performances and running lines for a couple of these. He's in really sharp form right now, and he's very tough to beat. So I do think Noble Thought makes some sense here for sure. I think the pace could be on the swifter side with horses like Honorable Hero and Castano, and then even Rejected Again, probably all trying to be forwardly placed. So I do think the pace should be honest, and we shouldn't expect a runaway Heeman Harkey like he had to try to deal with last time. And then Boru was the other one that you mentioned. I thought made a lot of sense. Um, this horse is just ultra consistent. He hasn't been beaten more than 2 lengths since May of 2018. But unfortunately, he also hasn't exactly piled up the wins in that time frame either. So I wasn't really sure what to do with him. He always shows up with a good effort, but he is a 6-year-old that's 3 for 16 lifetime. The one positive, I think, is that he does go out second off the claim for Mike Maselli. So last 3 years, Formulator has Mike Maselli. It's 5 for 15, second off the claim. So not a huge sample size, but enough for me to take notice anyway. And I do think he might get that similar kind of a trip as Noble Thoughts, where he kind of sits off the pace a little bit and maybe able to make his move to run down some of the tiring leaders. But again, there was a lot of ways to go here, and it was hard for me to feel great about anybody.
Yeah, that's an interesting point about Baru second off the claim. And I think he is a horse that has a right to take a step forward. It's just, he's got a tough post position being all the way out there going the mile and 16th on the inner. If the pace does shake out the way that we think and some horses do go forward, maybe he'll have that opportunity to get over a little bit closer to the rail by the time they make that bend into the backstretch. But that is always a little difficult to break from that post position. But definitely a competitive race. There are many ways to go. You can make a case for multiple long shots in this one. So it does feel like this could be a spread race. And before we kind of wrap things up, I just want to talk a little bit about this entire sequence looking back. And I don't know if you're much of a pick five player or if you have strong thoughts about how you would construct this particular ticket, but it sounds to me like, based on our discussion, it's one where we might go a little bit thin in the early races and perhaps try to spread a little bit more in races like the Belmont Derby and maybe this last one.
Yeah, David, I've never seen a pick five I didn't like. So I think I certainly will be playing this pick five on Saturday. And I do think that's probably the approach that I'll take. I think that early on, I'll be fairly narrow on my tickets. I'll probably have most of my money going through Santa Barbara. Depending how much money she takes, she almost may fall into that camp of singler or tosser, because you certainly don't want to have equal money going through 4 and 5 horses if you're including a horse that's going to be an odds-on favorite. So I'll have most of my money going through her, and then also be fairly skinny to Australasia and maybe a little super sensational in that second race. I don't know exactly how I'd handle the Bolshoi Ballet race quite yet. I'm certainly not going to build around him, but I haven't fully decided if it's a horse that I'm going to totally leave off or not. And then in the last 2 races, I won't have that much coverage in the 10th race because I do think that race is fairly cut and dry. But in the 11th race, I'm certainly going to have the spread because I do think any number of horses could probably win there.
Yeah, that was the kind of tricky one for me, figuring out what to do with Bolshoi Ballet, because I think it's the kind of situation where you can ask yourself, okay, if both Aidan O'Brien horses win, is the sequence going to be so chalky that I don't need to hit it? So can I just kind of leave out that combination? And I think it remains to be seen, and it kind of depends on your opinions in the other races. If you really do like some long shots in the last race, or you want to get alive to certain horses, he might be a horse that you do want to throw in your ticket somewhere. That being Bolshoi Ballet and the Belmont Derby, but I also understand the viewpoint that maybe you just want to try to get a little creative in there and fade him a little bit off your tickets. So I think they're both valid ways to go about this sequence.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think, with the chalk looking pretty formidable, I think that's probably the one I'd like to beat the most. So that's probably the way I would approach it. Is if he beats me, then my opinions would mean it doesn't pay much, and I'm okay with missing that one.
Well, Caleb, I thought that this was great. We agreed a lot, so hopefully we gave out some good opinions here and help some people hit this pick five sequence on Saturday. But I really appreciate you coming on the podcast. And before I let you go, just kind of remind people where they can follow you or find some of your stuff.
Yeah, definitely. So you can find me personally on Twitter. You can find me at Caleb WVU. You can also find our group, Mark, Chase, Brian, and Josh on The Wrong Lead. That's at Wrong Lead on Twitter, wrong_lead on Twitter. And we're on YouTube every Thursday night. So about 7:30 Central, we'll come online. You can just look us up there. We do have a website and anywhere else. And if you're just interested in kind of jumping in the Discord, then check out the horse racing Discord as well. A lot of good content in there, and it's a good place to bounce ideas off of people. If you're going through handicapping and aren't sure how to tackle a race, there's never a shortage of opinions. So definitely check us out. And if you want to take a look at Stable Duel as well, we're starting to work that in as well. So if you have any passing interest in fantasy sports or DFS, married with racing, that's a good way to get involved as well. And also just thank you again, David, for having me on the show. It's been a lot of fun.
Awesome. Yeah. Thanks for coming on. I thought this was a good discussion about the races. Everybody, if you want to listen to future TimeformUS podcasts, remember that you can catch us always on DRF.com, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. Wherever you get your podcast, just make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Form channel. Thanks for tuning in this week, and I'll be back with a couple more podcasts next week as we get back to 2 a week, the Pacecast and the Forecast. Look for the next one coming up on Tuesday. Thanks for listening, everybody.